Welcome to the next of our studies into Christianity. This is the first of a two-part study into the role of women in Christianity. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a famous campaigner in the suffrage movement in the 19th century. She said, "The Bible and the Church have been the greatest stumbling blocks in the way of women's emancipation. In the early days of the women's suffrage campaign, I saw that the greatest obstacle we had to overcome was the Bible. It was hurled at us on every side. All the religions on the face of the earth, including Christianity, degrade women, and so long as woman accepts the position that they assign her, her emancipation is impossible." Another campaigner, Josephine Henry, said, "No institution in modern civilization is so tyrannical and so unjust to woman as is the Christian Church." About 300 years earlier, Martin Luther, the founder of Protestantism in the 16th century, said, "If a woman grows weary and at last dies from childbearing, it matters not. Let her die from bearing, she is there to do it." So what led these three people to hold their particular views? Surely everyone revered the Bible back in those days. What could have caused these two 19th century women to say such things about the Bible? And why would Luther have spoken of women in such a way? Let's look a little bit closer at what the Bible actually says about women. We'll start with the book of Genesis, and we know this book was written about 800 years after the time of Moses. By then the male culture of priests and scribes was long established. In Genesis 2 we read that woman was made for man. In the next chapter, woman is blamed for the fall of the entire human race. That's a huge burden to bear. And Genesis 3:16, he will rule over you. In other words, men will rule over women. In Genesis 19 we read the gruesome story of how Lot handed over his 2 virgin daughters to a perverted mob in order to protect his guests. He tells the rapists to do what you like with them. This is the same Lot who is called just and righteous in the New Testament, 2 Peter. Exodus 22:18 says, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." Now this one verse alone caused the suffering and deaths of untold thousands of innocent women. Surely a real God would have foreseen the effect of this verse: torture, burnings, drownings and terror. Now some Christians might argue that this wasn't true Christianity, that the priests and believers who carried out these murders weren't true Christians. How can you say that when there are verses like this in the Bible? This is a specific command from God to murder women. Leviticus 12 gives us an insight into the way God views boys and girls. A woman who gives birth to a boy is to be unclean for 7 days. Then she needs 33 days before she's purified. If it's a girl, on the other hand, the mother is unclean for 14 days. Then she needs 66 days to be purified. What this tells us is that girls are twice as dirty as boys, twice as defiling or twice as impure. Now after this, the woman has to make a sin offering. So basically having children is both sinful and unclean, according to God. Can't you tell that this was written by men and not by a God? In Deuteronomy 21, and this is God speaking, here God gives permission to rape captive women. "If you notice a beautiful woman, bring her into your house, make her shave her head, trim her nails, and put aside the clothes she was wearing when captured. You may go to her and be her husband. You must not sell her because you have dishonoured her." Notice here that God permits this, even though he points out that it is dishonouring to the woman. Now God, speaking in Deuteronomy 22, tells us to stone to death any woman who wasn't a virgin when married. He says, "If no proof of the girl's virginity can be found, the men of the town shall stone her to death." Can you imagine that? This is what the Christian God commanded. Have you ever seen a stoning? Here's how it worked. The victim is wrapped tightly in a sheet. A male is buried up to the waist with his hands tied behind his back, while a female is usually buried up to her neck. Spectators then carry out the execution by hurling rocks and stones. The stones are deliberately chosen to be large enough to cause pain, but not big enough to kill the person in just 1 or 2 strikes. There are plenty of videos on the internet if you have the stomach to see what the Christian God commanded. Some Muslims still carry out stonings. In Numbers 5, and this is a direct command from God, we read about the test for the adulteress. Any time a husband feels jealous or suspects his wife, he can bring her to the priest. The priest makes up a drink from the sweepings off the tabernacle floor. This will contain dirt and dust, plus the remains of many animal sacrifices, so blood and offal, all swirling around in holy water. She must drink it. Now if she's guilty, according to God, she will have bitter suffering and her belly will swell. There is no equivalent test for men. Deuteronomy 22. If a woman is raped but fails to scream for help, she is to be stoned to death. It says, "You shall take both of them to the gate of that town and stone them to death." Notice the rapist has to be stoned too, because he violated another man's wife. In other words, this is considered a property crime. Again, this is one of the most brutal sections in the whole Bible. This is God speaking, Deuteronomy 22. If a man rapes a virgin, he must pay the girl's father some money, he must marry her, and they must stay married for the rest of their lives. In other words, the raped woman must marry her rapist and stay married to him her whole life. What kind of insanity is this? Remember, this is a direct command from God. In the second part, we'll look at more biblical instruction concerning women, including the part where God defines the relative values of men and women.